decided to put on my glasses. My contact was bothering me, so now I get to look even more like a dork with my taped up glasses. They were taped up for a reasonably cool reason, so I'm okay with it. That was in a pit for a punk show. At any rate, so we had been talking prior to the midterm about the concepts of a recessionary and an inflationary gap, where a recessionary gap was essentially when your equilibrium GDP on the demand side, the intersection between the 45-degree line and your aggregate expenditure line, was lower than your potential GDP, and an inflationary gap when it's higher than your potential GDP. And now I want to kind of do a little bit of a recap on that, and then talk about it in the context of your aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So bringing in the aggregate supply portion of this. Okay. So let's start with where we were before the midterm. So I have here my aggregate expenditure model, my equilibrium GDP being here. Okay, and then you could also say your equilibrium GDP is here. Okay, because at the equilibrium, your x-axis has to equal your y-axis, right? And your equilibrium GDP is here, so your equilibrium GDP is also here. More importantly, this is your aggregate expenditure, though. So this is the point at which aggregate expenditure equals national income equals output. They're all the same. Okay. So if I have equilibrium GDP over here, okay, I'm going to just abbreviate this actually to EQ GDP. All right. And then let's say I have a potential GDP of here. Okay, so my potential GDP is this green line. Okay. So the first thing you're going to ask is, why is potential GDP a straight line? Unless you remember already. So potential GDP is one number for a particular time period. It is your full employment GDP. So if you take away the cyclical elements of the economy, recession and inflation, it's your GDP when you don't have those cyclical elements, when everything is being fully employed. But in a cycle, you could have more employment or less employment than full employment. And just a reminder, full employment is when everybody who wants a job let me rephrase that. Full employment is when there's no cyclical unemployment, and cyclical unemployment is unemployment due to the business cycle. So there's three types of unemployment: structural, cyclical, and frictional. Frictional is short-term, usually due to just quote-unquote frictions in the job market. Short-term turnaround. I'm looking for a job and I need a month or two to find one. Structural unemployment is really long-term unemployment. Those are, I was a carpenter, and all of a sudden, all carpentry is being automated. Okay, that's structural unemployment. I don't know if carpentry is being automated. I'm not actually sure. Then there's cyclical unemployment, which is, my business is, they didn't get the number of customers that they want this year, and therefore they had to make layoffs. It's due to relationships with the overall economy. So unlike structural unemployment, where it's more about your skill set being out of demand, and unlike frictional unemployment, which has nothing to do with your skill set at all, and has nothing really to do with the business at all, it has more to do with just timing. Cyclical unemployment is very much affected by, is there enough demand today? Is there is are consumers consuming, that kind of thing? Things that have to do with the overall state of the economy from day to day, month to month, year to year. So full employment is when there's no cyclical unemployment, when the economy isn't being affected by, or hypothetically isn't being affected by, day-to-day aggregate demand shocks. Okay, we're aggregate supply shocks too. So this potential GDP is going to be a straight line because it's just one number corresponding to what the full employment is at any particular period of time. And what GDP in particular, what GDP that full employment will have at any particular period of time. Okay, so if your potential GDP is here, straight line, it's less than your equilibrium GDP. Okay. Sorry. So here's one. Come on, I want to select. There we go. So I just drew the purple markers for where the equilibrium is and where the potential is. I want to make this smaller. Instead of making it smaller, I don't really have an option. I'm just going to shift this over. Okay. Where this purple X doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be here, it doesn't have to be here. It's just horizontally aligned with the other purple X because that's where the equilibrium is. There's no real significance to what the purple X's mean or anything like that. They're just demarcating where the beginning and ends of well, I guess this purple X is the equilibrium for the demand side for a particular price level. This purple X here is just a horizontal, like keeping that same price level for that potential GDP. But this purple line here, let's see what. That's better. All right, that purple line here is our inflationary gap. Okay. Why is it the inflationary gap? Why is it not a recessionary gap? Okay. Well, first of all, if your equilibrium GDP is greater than your potential GDP, you're above potential. That sounds like a good thing, not like a recession. And in general, it's a little bit good to be in an inflationary gap, like if it's a small inflationary gap. But if it's a giant inflationary gap, then it's not good. So why is it inflationary? Essentially, if your equilibrium GDP is higher than your potential GDP, it means your employment levels are higher than full employment. Okay. Essentially, that means you're not only employing everybody who's cyclically unemployed, you're employing some people who are structurally unemployed, and you're employing people who are frictionally unemployed. So people who are frictionally unemployed are getting employed faster. People who are structurally unemployed are being employed as well. By doing so, you're essentially driving the wage up, right? The more people who are who have jobs, and the more, like, if you still want to fulfill those jobs, you have to pay them a higher wage, right? Because there's more people. There's less open spaces for the people. There's more open spaces and less people to fill them, right? So you have to get the people to fill your particular open space, you're going to bargain up the wage, right? If there's one worker left in the pool, and there's 100 job openings because your economy is expanding like well above where it should be. You're going to compete with 100 other or 99 other job openings to get that one worker, driving up the wage. And it doesn't have to be 1 and 99. The point of the story is there's more open roles than there are people to fill them, such that the wages start driving up above where they really should be in the long run. This leads to, and my eyes look really googly in the thing because of the reflections of the different things, and it's bothering me. The different screens. It's really getting to me. But I look like a weird. I don't know. I look weird. No, I just want this to stop. That's not helpful. Anyway, so you're driving up the wages, okay, in order to then produce at cost or produce slightly above cost, in order to justify there being a product. Then you're going to have to raise prices. When you raise prices, what ends up happening is inflation. So producing above potential GDP leads to an increase in job openings, which leads to higher wages, which leads to higher prices, which is inflation. Okay? So that's why it's called an inflationary gap. If you produce above the potential GDP for a long enough period of time, you should see inflation. Right? So in order to quell it, sorry, I'm going ahead there. In turn, let's say our potential GDP were over here. Okay. AKA over here, right? This is still our equilibrium GDP. This is still equilibrium aggregate expenditure. Come on, I just want that purple. Go away. All right, I am not getting that X out of there. I guess I got it. Nope. All right, I give up. It's not that important that X moves. That's whatever. Whatever. This X is annoying me now. I've given up on it. If your potential GDP is like here, this is now your gap, and it is a recessionary gap. Okay. Let's bring it down. Okay. So this is a gap that arises when you're producing less than your potential GDP. So I should have brought this. Okay. So again, the mechanism is recession is when output is below, when output drops for 2 consecutive quarters, essentially. So if your equilibrium GDP, your output, is below your potential GDP, that's a recessionary gap eventually that's going to lead to a recession. Okay? So how does this work with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model? Okay, so if we took that price level as equilibrium price here, okay, like let's say this is a horizontal line leading from this dotted line over to this dotted line, and it looks roughly about that. If our potential GDP is here, and this is our equilibrium GDP, okay, right, so this equilibrium GDP corresponds to this price level, right? Actually, this line could be wherever. That's actually irrelevant. Now I'm going to get rid of the purple X as vendetta. This line, wherever it winds up, doesn't have to line up with this dotted line. That was a mistake. Because this dotted line corresponds to equilibrium aggregate expenditure. Price has nothing to do with this graph here. Okay, if price changes, this is going to change. Okay, but let's assume that for this equilibrium price, we have this aggregate expenditure function. Okay, then this equilibrium GDP is equal to this equilibrium GDP. Okay, and then in that case, we can say that this potential GDP would correspond to like that potential GDP. It doesn't, like, it's not a given that this aggregate expenditure schedule, the price that's like in the background of this is equal to this equilibrium price, but it doesn't make sense to look at something where this aggregate expenditure price level isn't. Like, this is essentially, we would be backing this one out. Let me rephrase that a little more clearly. If I know what the equilibrium price level is, it doesn't make sense to look at the aggregate expenditure line for a different price level. Okay. If I don't know what the equilibrium price level is, then it does. But we want to consider aggregate expenditure where the equilibrium for the ADAS model is. Okay. So if this is our potential GDP, I guess I already wrote it. Let's bring this bad boy back, actually. Okay. If this is our potential GDP, this is our equilibrium GDP in the ADAS model, aggregate demand, aggregate supply. You have the same recessionary gap. It's just going to be, do I have a little squiggly? Nope. This here. The difference between the equilibrium GDP and the potential GDP. Okay? And if potential GDP is here, well, then you have an inflationary gap where your equilibrium GDP is greater than your potential GDP. And everything froze. That's great. So now we're in an inflationary gap. Let's make it so that the purple line actually matches. Oh, come on, stop being this way. There you go. It's been like lagging because technology-wise, nothing can work for me today. It's the rule. All right. So there's your inflationary gap. All right. And what happens in an inflationary gap? So consider your potential GDP almost, not even almost, like a long-run aggregate supply curve. Okay. This is your short-run aggregate supply. This over here. This is your long-run aggregate supply. Why can it also be seen as a long-run aggregate supply? In the long run, prices are not sticky, right? In the sense of wages go down or can go down in the long run. Cost of capital can go down. In the long run, everything's negotiable. Input costs can change. So essentially, you're going to supply in order to meet, or you're going to supply at your maximum potential, right? And the only thing really that can move potential GDP in the long run, as we talked about before, is changes in technology, right? It's not about the employment or the price of your inputs. So you can consider your potential GDP your long-run aggregate supply. If in the long run you're moving towards, let's say you're fixing demand, in the long run you're moving your supply curve closer and closer to this potential GDP, your price level is eventually going to increase. Your equilibrium price is going to go from this one here to up here, okay, where this aligns. Sorry, I kind of muddled that. Where this one aligns over here, okay? So the intersection between here and here, okay? So that's why you'll see inflation. You'll start seeing workers renegotiate their salary, and production is going to start shifting in as input costs start increasing. Okay, and then you're going to meet over here, right? So that's why it's inflationary. In the long run, your price is going to increase. See here. So from here to like here, where these two intersect. And then recessionary, if this thing, see, I planned the whole thing based on whiteboard today, and it decided that it was going to crap out for no reason. Come on. All right. So here's a recessionary gap. This is the most frustrating software in the whole world. Oh my God. Just let me select the thing that I want to select. I just want the purple. Right. That only took 45 minutes. Sorry about that. I'm about to see a grown man destroy a computer in 10 seconds. All right. Seriously? Recession. It's like pulling teeth. All right. All right, so potential GDP should be a little bit closer to here. This will be roughly your long-run aggregate supply. There's your recessionary gap. Okay. So you're producing below your equilibrium output. Okay. And two things can happen. Your input prices could either decrease. Input prices could either decrease. Okay. And supply could shift out and meet demand at this new equilibrium GDP. Okay, so new equilibrium GDP down here with a decrease in price. That would be the best of both worlds. However, we know that prices are generally downward sticky, such that, at least in the short run, the supply curve is probably not going to shift out that quickly, that fast. That's redundant. So more likely, your potential GDP is going to have to drop. Okay. Alternatively, what you're going to see is as prices drop, you're going to see demand increase. Okay, that's going to take a little while too. So essentially what you're going to want to do is you're going to induce an increase in demand, okay, in order to essentially counteract the recession and meet your supply curve up here, okay, which is also going to lead to a little bit of inflation, but probably not as much as with an inflationary gap. So like right now, there's essentially deflation, where you kind of want deflation, such that price is lower, leading to a supply shift downwards, and maybe then you can induce some aggregate expenditure increase that'll increase your demand and have that meet over here, and eventually like the two meet at your potential GDP. That's going to take a while. So really you want some sort of policy implication, which is going to be the thing we're going to talk about next. Let's just, however, kick through the slides for a second, because I realize I've gone a little bit off the rails there. I did want to use the whiteboard tool for a while. I didn't anticipate going that long on it. So let me take a little bit of a break. It's getting a little bit past my bedtime, and we'll talk about recessionary and inflationary gaps. I'll probably actually cut this a little bit short and just upload what I have on YouTube now, do the next hour and a half of lecture tomorrow, I guess. So, yeah. All right. So yeah, I'll kick it off here, and then we'll talk about recessionary and inflationary gaps tomorrow.